I was cleaning out my late father's Navy trunk when I found the receipt that changed everything. The trunk had sat in my garage for years, collecting dust, the brass lock tarnished and stiff. He'd been gone since I was 19, officially missing in action after a deployment that no one in the family liked to talk about. When I finally worked up the nerve to open it, I thought I was just sorting through medals and uniforms for donation. I didn't expect to find a clue, a tiny piece of paper that made my hands shake. The receipt was crumpled, faded from a cafe called The Second Cup. I'd never heard of it. On the back, in a hand I didn't recognize, was written, "Come back when you're ready to start over." I sat back on the cold concrete floor, staring at those words. They felt too personal to be random. My father had been a disciplined man, the kind who labeled every folder and polished every medal. He didn't do cryptic messages, but he had always believed in timing. "The right order matters, Evelyn," he used to say. "Even in chaos, find the right sequence." I didn't know what start over meant for me. I'd served 2 Marine Corps 10 years. I'd done my tours, led my platoon, earned my commendations. But after my discharge 2 years ago, I'd drifted. Civilian life was louder than any battlefield. The quiet made me restless. The noise made me anxious. I was 33, working part-time at a veterans outreach office, telling other soldiers how to rebuild their lives, while mine sat in storage. I flipped the receipt over again. The ink had bled slightly, like it had seen water or sweat. I imagined my father's rough hands folding it, his thumb pressing that faint smudge near the corner. I told myself it couldn't be his writing. His cursive had a sharper slant, but the thought still hit me in the chest. Maybe it was a joke, a scrap left by someone else. But my gut said otherwise. It said go. The cafe was across town, a half-hour drive through Phoenix traffic. I almost didn't go. It felt ridiculous chasing a ghost over a coffee receipt. But staying home felt worse. The trunk sat open on the floor metals, glinting under the garage light, and that single scrap of paper felt like a heartbeat I couldn't ignore. When I got there, The Second Cup looked ordinary. A small shop tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore, the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked. Bells on the door chimed as I stepped in. The air smelled of coffee and something sweet like cinnamon rolls just out of the oven. A few customers sat quietly reading newspapers or tapping laptops. Everything felt warm, familiar, almost staged. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 60s. Gray hair, tied back sleeves, rolled eyes, kind but sharp. She looked up, saw me, and smiled like she'd been expecting me. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said. Her words froze me. "Excuse me." She wiped her hands on a towel, calm as could be. "You're here about something you found, in a trunk." My throat tightened. "How do you know that?" She nodded toward the faded receipt in my hand. "Because that's my handwriting." For a second the whole world went silent except for the low hum of the espresso machine. I stepped closer, heart pounding. "You wrote this?" "Yes, about 6 years ago." She studied me carefully, like comparing me to a memory. "He told me you'd come when you were ready." I couldn't breathe. "Who told you?" "The woman June," her name tag said, smiled softly. "Your father." That made no sense. My father's dead. June tilted her head. "That's what they said." I stood there, gripping the counter, trying to make sense of her words. Every logical part of me wanted to walk out, but something hope maybe held me still. "What did he tell you?" "That you'd lost your way. That someday you'd come looking for him, not in the way people usually do, but through something small. A message, a reminder." I stared at her, waiting for more, but she just reached under the counter and pulled out a small box, wooden, weathered, about the size of a cigar case. She slid it toward me. "He left this here for you. Said to give it only when the time was right." My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside was a Zippo lighter, silver-scratched, engraved with his initials TH. Under it lay a folded piece of paper. My father's handwriting this time, unmistakable. The same slanted lines I'd seen on birthday cards and old mission notes. "Eve, start over means tell the truth." That was it. No signature, no explanation, just those words. I sat down at the nearest table, feeling dizzy. Tell the truth. About what he'd been, a Navy commander, strict by the book, sometimes cold, but never dishonest. I unfolded the note again, hoping for hidden meaning. The edges were yellowed, the ink slightly smeared like it had been written in haste. June placed a cup of coffee beside me. On the house, she said. He liked his black no sugar. I thought maybe you would too. I didn't drink it. I just stared into the dark surface, watching the reflection of the cafe lights ripple. Did he come here often? Not often, June said. Just once. The day before his last deployment. We talked for hours. About you. That last part hit harder than I expected. About me. She nodded. He said he'd been too hard on you, that Marines and Navy share a uniform color but not always a language. He wanted you to know he respected you even if he didn't say it enough. I felt my throat close up. My father wasn't a man of soft words. He led with orders, not apologies. Hearing that from a stranger felt impossible, and yet it sounded exactly like him. June leaned on the counter, eyes steady. He told me if you ever came to remind you that honor isn't about revenge. It's about setting things right. I couldn't respond. My hands were still wrapped around the lighter. The metal was cold, heavy with memory. Outside, the late afternoon sun had begun to fade, turning the windows amber. I sat there long after the coffee went cold, the words looping in my head, start over, tell the truth. When I finally stood to leave, June called after me, you'll be back. I turned. How can you be so sure? She smiled gently. Because you're not done yet. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lighter on my nightstand, its weight like an anchor beside me. The note lay unfolded on the dresser where I could read it every time I turned over. Start over means tell the truth. I repeated those words until dawn. By morning, I decided to go back to the cafe. Not out of faith, out of stubbornness. I needed facts. I'd spent a lifetime following reports, not riddles. If my father truly left something for me, I wanted proof of how and why. June was already behind the counter when I arrived, arranging pastries in the display case. The place smelled like warm bread and roasted beans. She looked up unsurprised. Good morning, Major Hart, she said. I blinked. How did you? She smiled. He told me you'd make rank one day. He was proud of that. I swallowed hard, my mind spinning. You knew my father's rank, his unit. I knew enough. She gestured toward the stool near the counter. Sit. I made you something stronger than yesterday's coffee. When she placed the mug in front of me, I noticed her hand steady, practiced a ring mark on one finger that hadn't seen a band in years. Tell me how you met him, I said. June took a slow breath, eyes unfocused as if watching a film from long ago. He came in wearing civilian clothes but carried himself like an officer. It was near closing time. He ordered plain coffee and sat right over there. She pointed to the corner table by the window. Didn't say much at first, just looked like a man wrestling with ghosts. What did he say to you? That he'd made a mistake letting silence do the talking in his family. He wanted to fix something but didn't know how. I felt my chest tighten. He left for his final deployment the next day. June nodded slowly. He knew that too. Said if anything happened to him, maybe I could help you find your way back. So he left me something for you. My pulse quickened. Something else. Yes. She crouched behind the counter and lifted a small steel locker, the kind used for cash drops. The padlock was old but polished. He told me not to open it. Said the key would come with the right person. I reached into my pocket and felt the lighter. The base had a small notch barely visible before. I twisted it gently and a tiny key slid out from inside. June smiled faintly. He thought of everything. The lock clicked open, metal against metal, loud in the quiet cafe. Inside were 3 items, a folded photocopy of a Navy incident report, a small photograph, and another handwritten note. The photo was old Dad in uniform, arm around a younger officer with bright, ambitious eyes. The back read, USS Fulton, March 2008. The officer beside him was identified as Lieutenant Commander Ethan Cole. My pulse quickened. That name was familiar. Cole had spoken at a veterans event 2 years ago, some polished defense consultant now talking about leadership and accountability. I'd shaken his hand briefly afterward. He'd looked through me like I was invisible. I turned to the photocopy. It was part of a naval inquiry summary, half the lines blacked out, but I could make out words: equipment malfunction, safety drills postponed. Hart's objection filed, command override signed Cole. My stomach turned. Dad had reported a safety issue. Cole had ignored it. The note beneath it was short, my father's handwriting again. If you're reading this, it means the sea kept my truth longer than I could. Don't let silence win, Evelyn. Tell the truth, no matter what it costs. I sat there, unable to speak. The air in the cafe felt heavy, thick with memory and betrayal. June reached across the counter, her touch light but grounding. He carried a burden he couldn't shake. I think he hoped you'd finish what he started. But why me? I whispered. He had officers, lawyers, records. Why me? Because you carry his name, June said softly. And because you know what it means to serve. You understand duty, but you also understand pain. He believed only you could turn the truth into something that heals. I stared at the document again. 6 sailors had died in that incident. The report called it an unavoidable systems failure. But if this evidence was real, it wasn't unavoidable, it was negligence. Covered up. For years, I'd believed my father's death was an accident. I'd even doubted him at times after hearing the rumors talk of insubordination, of rash decisions during a storm. I'd buried that shame deep. And now, here it was proof that he had been right. I felt anger rise in my chest like a tide. Cole's still out there living comfortably, giving speeches about leadership while my father's record says, possible misconduct. June didn't flinch. Then you know what you have to do. Expose him. She shook her head gently. Tell the truth. There's a difference. I sat back, jaw tight. You sound like him. Good, then maybe you're hearing him too. I slipped the photocopy and note into my bag. My pulse was still racing, but under the anger there was clarity, the kind Marines call target lock. I stood to leave. If there's more, I need to know. There's someone who served with him, June said. A man named Chief Miller. Retired now, lives near the VA hospital downtown. He used to come in here sometimes, always asked about your father. Said the official story never sat right. I nodded, memorizing the name. As I turned toward the door, June called after me, Evelyn. I looked back. If you go digging into this, do it for the right reason. Your father wanted peace, not vengeance. Remember that when things get heavy. I didn't answer. Maybe I didn't trust myself to. The sun outside was harsh, almost blinding after the cafe's warmth. I got into my car, gripped the steering wheel, and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror, eyes, red jaw clenched. Peace was noble, but peace wouldn't clear his name. Truth would. I started the engine and drove toward the VA district, the Zippo still warm in my pocket, the words looping in my head. Start over means tell the truth. But as I hit the first stoplight, I couldn't help thinking sometimes, to tell the truth, you have to burn the lies first. The VA district on Jefferson always smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. The walls were plastered with faded recruitment posters, be all you can be, the few, the proud. I'd walked through those halls before to help other veterans with paperwork, but this time felt different. This time, I was the one chasing ghosts. Chief Miller wasn't hard to find. The receptionist pointed me to the small veterans' breakfast held every Tuesday in the community room. Pancakes, instant eggs, and a dozen gray-haired men in baseball caps that read, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm. The kind of quiet fellowship that civilians never really understand. He sat at the end of the table, broad-shouldered, even in his 70s, his hands calloused and scarred. The kind of man who'd spent more years at sea than on land. When I introduced myself, his brow furrowed for a second before softening. Thomas Hart's girl, he said. I nodded. You served with him on the Fulton. Sure did. He gestured for me to sit. He was my CO. Best damn officer I ever had. Died a hero, they said. His eyes narrowed. That's not the story you heard, is it? I hesitated. They said it was an accident. Equipment malfunctioned during a storm. My uncle, he said Dad might have disobeyed orders. That he panicked. Miller's laugh was dry. Thomas Hart panic. Not a chance. He leaned closer, voice low. He filed 3 reports before that deployment, said the new maintenance schedule was a disaster waiting to happen. Cole overrode him, said we'd fix it next port. Then came that storm. He paused, rubbing his jaw. We lost pressure in the lower deck. Hart stayed down there until the last kid made it out. When they found the log later, the signature page for the override was gone. Just gone. Could it have been an accident, I asked. Miller shook his head slowly. Accidents don't delete signatures, and men like Cole don't like blemishes on their records. My pulse pounded in my ears. Did you ever tell anyone? He smirked sadly. Told the inquiry board. They said my memory was foggy. Then they shipped me out early for medical review. That's Navy talk for shut up and retire. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. Would you talk again if I made this public? He looked me over. You still wear the uniform? No, I said quietly, but I remember what it means. He nodded. Then yeah, I'd talk. But tread careful, Major. Cole's got friends in high places. He sits on defense contracts now, same people who don't want old stories reopening. You dig too deep, you'll find your own name on a list. That didn't scare me, it motivated me. I thanked him, exchanged numbers, and walked out into the morning sun. The Arizona heat hit like a blast furnace. I stood there for a long moment thinking about the missing signature, the scrubbed pages, the hollow ceremony where they'd handed us my father's folded flag. For the first time I wondered if the flag had been folded over a lie. Back home I spread everything across my kitchen table, the Zippo, the photocopy, the photo, Miller's notes scribbled on a napkin. I took a deep breath and powered up my laptop. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request that night, FOIA Form 1995E. It wasn't my first. I'd helped plenty of vets chase down their records. But this time the form felt heavier. I cited the case, the ship, the date, and the report number from the photocopy. Then I clicked Submit. The confirmation email came back almost immediately. Your request has been received. Estimated response time 8 to 12 weeks. 8 to 12 weeks, bureaucracy's favorite stall tactic. I poured myself a drink and sat on the couch staring at the ceiling fan spinning above me. My father's voice echoed faintly in my memory. You can't rush the sea, Evelyn. You just have to stay afloat until the tide turns. But patience had never been my strong suit. 3 days later, June called. You've been busy, she said when I picked up. How do you know? She chuckled. You've got that restless sound, the kind people get when the truth's close enough to taste. I filed for the official report, I said. Now I wait. Then don't just wait, listen. Listen to what? To the people who were there. That night I drove back to the Veterans Hall. Some of the men were still there after hours swapping stories over black coffee. I told them who I was, what I was trying to do. Most were polite but hesitant until one man, a radar technician named Blake, spoke up. Your dad kept the ship steady through that storm, he said. We were supposed to be in lockdown, but he stayed topside. Said we couldn't afford another systems failure. I saw him with my own eyes. He didn't abandon anyone. He saved 3 of us before the deck went dark. He paused, the memory catching in his throat. After it happened, Cole came through the quarters, told everyone to stick to the official version. Said if we cared about the Navy's reputation, we'd stay quiet. The room went silent. Did anyone record that, I asked? No, Blake said, but I remember every word. I thanked him heart heavy with both gratitude and rage. Back in my car, I replayed every conversation in my mind. June's calm, Miller's gravel voice, Blake's haunted eyes. The threads were tightening. There was a story here, and I was the only one willing to tell it. But it wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about honor, a word my father had drilled into me since childhood. He'd once told me that honor isn't a medal. It's the difference between what's easy and what's right. Still, I couldn't pretend the anger wasn't there. Every time I thought of Cole's smug face at that veterans banquet shaking hands with generals and politicians, it burned. 2 weeks passed. I checked my email every morning, waiting for a FOIA response that never came. Then one afternoon as I was leaving work, I found an envelope under my windshield wiper. No return address. Just my name written in block letters. Inside were photocopied pages, portions of the maintenance log from the Fulton. One entry stood out. Drill postponed by XO Cole due to schedule conflict. CMDR Hart objected in writing. Entry removed from final report. At the bottom, a small note in pen, he wasn't wrong. Some of us still remember. I looked around the parking lot, half expecting to see someone watching. But there was only the hum of traffic and the setting sun reflecting off car roofs. Whoever had sent this was close, someone who wanted me to keep going, but quietly. That night, I spread the new documents out beside the old ones. My father's note stared back at me. Tell the truth. no matter what it costs. I realized what that meant now. The truth wasn't going to come from the Navy, it would have to come from the people who'd lived it and from me, his daughter, to give it voice. June's words echoed softly in my head. Honor isn't about revenge, it's about setting things right. Still, as I stared at the lighter in my palm, I whispered to myself, sometimes to set things right, you have to fight like hell. And I knew exactly where to start. I'd always believed the Navy kept its records like scripture, neat, complete, and unquestionable. That illusion shattered the moment I opened the FOIA response envelope. Half the pages were blacked out, paragraphs, signatures, even dates redacted under a thick line of government ink. They'd sent me a ghost story and called it closure. Still, I scanned every inch. Buried near the bottom of one form was a timestamp from an internal email chain. It showed maintenance deferment signed and approved by XOE Cole 24 hours before the incident. He'd postponed drills to save time. My father had objected, and that objection was gone, deleted from the final file. The anger came back like static under my skin. He'd been blamed for the failure branded reckless, while the real culprit climbed the corporate ladder and sold leadership seminars for 6 figures. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, stared at the papers on my table, and made a decision. If Cole had built his career on a lie, I'd make him face it in public. 2 days later, I called his office. A receptionist answered with syrupy professionalism. Mr. Cole's schedule is full for the next 2 weeks. Can I take a message? I almost hung up, but something in me hardened. Tell him Major Evelyn Hart called. Daughter of Commander Thomas Hart, USS Fulton. Silence. Then the woman's tone changed, cautious now. 1 moment. She came back 30 seconds later. He's not available, but he says he remembers your father. He also asked that any further contact go through his attorney. I smiled bitterly. That was as good as a confession. That night, I drove to June's cafe. She was restocking the pastry case when I walked in. You look like someone who picked a fight with a wall, she said, pouring me a cup before I even asked. I got the documents, I said. Half of them look like they were redacted by a toddler with a marker, but there's enough left to prove Cole postponed the drills. June listened quietly. I told her about the phone call, about the attorney's message, about my plan. I'm going to bring this to light, I said. Publicly. Maybe the local paper, maybe a hearing. I don't care how much noise it makes. June leaned her elbows on the counter. And what do you want to happen when it's out there? I want him to lose everything he built on my father's grave. She studied me for a moment. That sounds like revenge, not truth. I set my jaw. Maybe they're the same thing this time. No, she said softly. Revenge wants to destroy. Truth wants to heal. Her words stung because they sounded like something my father would have said. That night, my phone buzzed with a call from Uncle Ray. I hadn't spoken to him in months. You stirring up old ghosts again, Evelyn? He said without preamble. I took a breath. You knew, didn't you, that Cole buried Dad's report? He sighed. What difference does it make now? The Navy closed that chapter years ago. You think they'll thank you for tearing it open? I don't care about thanks. I care about his name. His name's fine where it is, Ray snapped. He's remembered as a casualty, not a scandal. You start digging and you'll drag the whole family through it again. Maybe it's time someone did. Ray's voice dropped to a growl. You think honor means digging up bones? Your father made choices out there. So did everyone else. Let the dead rest, Eve. He hung up before I could answer. The next morning, a white envelope was waiting at my doorstep. No return address again. Inside was another copy of the maintenance log, but this one wasn't redacted. At the bottom of the page, clear as day, was Cole's signature. Approved, E. Cole safety drill deferred. CMDR Hart objection noted. My breath caught. Whoever was sending these knew I was close, maybe closer than Cole wanted. There was a note stapled to the top. He's speaking at the Rotary Hall next Thursday. Bring the truth with you. Thursday came fast. I put on my dress blues, the same uniform I'd worn at my father's memorial. The metals were polished, the brass buttons gleamed, and the weight of the fabric felt like armor. When I walked into the Rotary Hall, the air was thick with aftershave and small talk. Cole stood near the podium, shaking hands, smiling the way only practiced men of power do. He spotted me before I reached him. His smile faltered. Major Hart, he said carefully, I wasn't expecting you. I didn't come for the coffee. His lawyer, a slick man in a gray suit, stepped forward. "If you have a matter to discuss, Major, this isn't the place." "Oh, I think it is." I pulled the document from my folder and handed it to Cole. "Recognize your signature." He glanced at it, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what this is." "It's your authorization to cancel safety drills on the Fulton, the same drills that could have saved 6 men, including my father." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Cole's lawyer grabbed my arm, whispering, "You're making a scene." "That's the idea," I said, pulling away. Cole's composure cracked. Those were decisions made under operational pressure. I won't be judged by someone who doesn't understand command responsibility. "Maybe you're right," I said evenly, "but I do understand something you don't: accountability." The crowd watched in silence. Cole shoved the paper back at me, his voice low. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "Neither did my father," I said. "He trusted the system. Look where it got him." I turned and walked out before anyone could stop me. My hands were shaking, not from fear but release. Years of silence had just cracked open. That night, I drove back to the second cup. June was wiping down tables as the cafe closed. "Did you do it?" she asked. I nodded, in front of 100 people. She studied me for a long time. "And how do you feel?" "Not sure yet," I admitted. Relieved, angry, maybe both. June poured 2 cups and slid one across the counter. "The truth has its own rhythm. It doesn't always sound like victory at first." I stared into the cup, the steam fogging my vision. "He'll try to spin it. He's too powerful not to." "Then make sure the next chapter isn't his to write," she said. "Tell the story, publicly, but tell it right." Her words steadied me. I'd spent years following orders. Now I had my own mission to clear my father's name, not with vengeance, but with evidence, voice, and light. I took one last sip of coffee, cold but strong, and whispered to myself, "This time the truth gets to speak first." When you grow up a Marine's daughter, you learn early that honor doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with bruises or silence or standing in a room full of people who wish you'd just sit down. The Rotary confrontation spread faster than I expected. By the next morning, a small local news blog ran a headline, "Retired Navy Executive Challenged Over Decade-Old Ship Incident." It wasn't front-page news, but it was enough to wake up the embers. Veterans started emailing, some supportive, some hostile, most just confused. June called that night. "You stirred the water," she said. "Now you have to decide what to do with the current." "I want to do this right," I told her. "Not just another argument online. Something where people can see the truth, where they can ask questions." She thought for a moment. "The church hall across the street. The Veterans Breakfast Group uses it once a month. I know the coordinator. If you want a place, you've got one." I hesitated. "You think anyone will show?" June smiled softly. "The truth has better attendance than you think." A week later, folding chairs filled the small church basement. The air smelled like coffee disinfectant and something fried, probably leftover from a fish dinner the night before. Flags hung on the walls. I recognized faces: Chief Miller, Radar Tech Blake, a few old-timers from the VA breakfast. Even Uncle Ray stood in the back, arms crossed tight over his chest. At the front table sat Ethan Cole and his lawyer, both stone-faced. They hadn't agreed to this willingly. Public pressure and a few persistent calls from a veteran advocacy group had made it hard for them to refuse. June poured coffee into paper cups along the back wall. "Keep your voice steady," she whispered as she passed me. "You're not here to shout, you're here to stand." I took the small podium, my hands trembling behind the notes. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I'm Major Evelyn Hart, U.S. Marine Corps, retired. My father was Commander Thomas Hart of the U.S. Navy. 15 years ago, he and 6 sailors died aboard the USS Fulton during what was called a systems failure. But new evidence shows it wasn't the sea that failed them, it was leadership." I held up the document. "These logs recently uncovered confirmed that required safety drills were postponed by then XO Ethan Cole." My father objected. His objection was removed from the record. "Those are facts, not opinions." Cole's lawyer started to speak, but I lifted a hand. "You'll have your turn. I've waited long enough for mine." I looked at the crowd, men with medals on their jackets, widows holding folded flags, grandsons in flannel shirts. My father died being called reckless. I believed it. I carried that shame like a second skin. But I've learned that silence can bury the truth deeper than any ocean. A murmur rippled through the room. Chief Miller stepped forward, voice firm. "She's telling it straight." Hart warned Cole before the storm. "We all knew those drills were overdue." Blake added, "He stayed topside to keep that ship steady, saved me and 2 others." I watched Cole's jaw tighten. His lawyer leaned over whispering something, but Cole waved him off. For the first time, he looked human. Not a corporate face, but a man cornered by his own past. He rose slowly, smoothing his tie. "You want the truth?" "Fine. The drills were delayed. The equipment was under repair." Commander Hart disagreed, and I made the call. I was XO, it was my decision. "Your wrong decision," I said quietly. He hesitated, then nodded slightly. Yes, it was. A stunned silence filled the room. Even the coffee urn stopped gurgling. Cole looked down, voice rough. I told myself it was just a scheduling issue, that we'd make up the time later. But I knew the storm was coming. I knew Hart was right. When the alarms went off that night, he stayed on deck while I was below checking logs that wouldn't matter in 10 minutes. He did what I should have done. His lawyer whispered urgently, but Cole ignored him. "You want revenge, Major Hart? You've got it. You've stripped away the last lie I told myself." I shook my head. "No, sir, I don't want revenge. I want my father's name back." Cole blinked, stunned by my calmness. "And then what?" "Then you make it right. You can start by telling the Navy what you just told us." He looked around the room, the witnesses, the quiet veterans, the folded hands. Finally, he nodded. "I'll issue a statement. Publicly. I owe him that much." I exhaled slowly, the tension finally breaking. The crowd began to stir again, soft claps echoing like raindrops. Uncle Ray stepped forward, his eyes wet. "Eve," he said, voice cracking. "I should have believed you. I was scared. Scared of losing what little peace we had left. I repeated what people said about your dad because it was easier than facing the truth." I reached out and took his hand. "We all do what's easy sometimes." He squeezed back, whispering, "I'm proud of you." That nearly broke me. After the meeting, people lingered, hugging, murmuring thanks, leaving coins in the donation jar for the church. June brewed one last pot of coffee, her eyes meeting mine from across the room. When everyone had gone, she walked over and said softly, "You didn't destroy him." "I didn't have to," I said. "He destroyed himself." June nodded. "That's what truth does when it finally finds daylight." I stood there for a long time, listening to the echoes fade in the empty hall, the clatter of folding chairs, the creak of old wood, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. For years I'd imagined justice as something loud and final like a gavel or a gunshot, but it turned out justice could be quiet too. Sometimes it just sounds like a man finally telling the truth. When I walked outside, the evening sky was bruised purple clouds drifting over the church steeple. I looked down at the Zippo in my hand, flipped it open and whispered, "We did it, Dad. We told the truth." The flame flickered once steady and golden. For the first time in years I felt light. The following week felt like a slow sunrise, the kind that doesn't blind you all at once but warms everything it touches. The Navy issued an official addendum to the USS Fulton inquiry. For the first time, Commander Thomas Hart's record listed service with honor. The amendment was brief, one paragraph buried on a government website, but to me it meant the world. My father's name had finally been pulled from the shadows. A small ceremony followed at the community center. No cameras, no reporters, just a handful of veterans, and a flag folded neatly on the table. Cole was there too. He looked older than I remembered from the forum. Maybe the truth had aged him overnight. When our eyes met, he gave a small nod of respect. No words. None were needed. When the event ended, Cole approached me quietly. "Major Hart," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "I've resigned from the contractor board. I'm setting up a safety scholarship in your father's name for naval cadets who file the reports others ignore." I studied him for a moment. There was no performance in his tone, no polish. Just a man stripped down to what was left of his conscience. "That's a start," I said. He nodded once. "It's the least I can do." That night I drove to my mother's house, a small ranch-style home on the outskirts of Tempe that hadn't changed since I was a kid. The porch light flickered, same as always. When she opened the door, her face was older, gentler somehow. I saw the news, she said softly. They finally corrected it. I stepped inside. The air smelled like coffee and furniture polish, and something else like lavender and dust, the smell of memory. On the dining table sat a stack of old letters tied with navy blue ribbon. I found these after your father's memorial, she said, sitting down. I never had the heart to read them. Maybe it's time. I untied the ribbon with careful fingers. Most were official duty logs, letters from shipmates, but near the bottom there was one envelope marked simply Eve. The handwriting stopped me cold. I opened it slowly, the paper fragile but still sharp at the edges. Eve, if you ever come across this, it means I didn't make it home. You've always had more courage than I taught you to have. You follow orders, but you think for yourself. That's rare. If there's one lesson I left unfinished, it's this: honor isn't the absence of mistakes. It's what you do after them. If you ever feel lost, start over with the truth. I raised you to choose courage over comfort. I'm proud of you no matter what you choose next. Dad. My throat tightened. I folded the letter gently, holding it against my chest. He knew, I whispered, even back then. Mom smiled through tears. He always knew you'd find your way back. A few days later, I met June at the second cup. The place was busier than usual, probably from the story spreading among local veterans. A hand-painted sign above the counter now read, "Second Chances Night every first Friday." June explained as she poured 2 coffees. Cole reached out after the hearing, offered to fund a monthly meetup for vets and families, a space to talk, compare records, help each other with VA claims. We're calling it the Heart Program. I blinked. You're serious? She nodded. Truth has to keep working or it goes stale. This place will keep it alive. I looked around. The cafe had become something more than a coffee shop, a quiet repair station for broken stories. In one corner, a Vietnam vet was explaining how to file a missing medal request to a younger Marine. Near the window, a widow read a letter aloud to 2 strangers who listened without interrupting. It was the sound of healing, small, imperfect human. Later, as the crowd thinned, Uncle Ray walked in. He looked hesitant at first, holding his hat awkwardly in both hands. I heard about this meeting, he said. Thought maybe I could help. I know a thing or two about filing paperwork. June grinned. We always need a man who can wrestle bureaucracy. Ray looked at me, his voice gentler than I'd ever heard it. Your father would have liked this. He never believed in fancy speeches. Just fixing what's broken. I smiled. Guess we're finally doing that. We sat for a while talking about old times. The air smelled like roasted beans and rain beginning outside. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the cafe window, not the haunted woman who'd walked in weeks ago, but someone lighter, steadier. That night, before heading home, I stood alone under the cafe's awning. The rain was steady but warm. I pulled out my father's Zippo, flicked it open, and watched the flame dance against the drizzle. Start over means tell the truth. He'd been right all along. Starting over wasn't about tearing down others. It was about rebuilding yourself piece by piece, even if your hands were shaking. I thought about Cole's confession, the scholarship, the veterans swapping stories inside. It wasn't vengeance that fixed anything, it was restoration. That was the difference between justice and ruin. The following morning I drove to the base cemetery. I hadn't visited in years. His headstone was simple, the kind he'd have chosen himself, CMDR, Thomas Hart, U.S. Navy Service with Honor. I knelt, brushed away the leaves, and placed the receipt beside the stone. The ink was nearly faded now, but I could still read the words, "Come back when you're ready to start over." I came back, I whispered, and I'm not done yet. The wind rustled through the flags nearby, and for a moment I could almost hear his voice, calm, steady, proud. As I stood to leave, my phone buzzed. It was an email from a regional news editor I'd met at the forum. Subject story, pitch restoring honor. They wanted me to write about the experience, about military families, and the cost of silence. I smiled. Yeah, Dad, I murmured, I'll tell them. When I got in the car, the rain had stopped and sunlight broke through the clouds. The world looked clean again. Sometimes restitution doesn't come as an apology or a medal. Sometimes it comes as a quiet morning and the freedom to breathe without guilt. 6 months later, the second cup was barely recognizable from the quiet cafe I'd first walked into. The walls now held framed photos of veterans and their families, each one with a short caption handwritten beneath, starting over, finding peace, telling the truth. Every first Friday, the place filled up with people who'd once sworn they had no stories left to tell. There were retired sailors, army medics, Marine wives, even a few high school kids working on a history project. They came for the coffee, but they stayed for the stories. June called it community therapy in disguise. She still wore that same apron and carried herself with the calm of someone who'd already learned every important lesson there is. I'd taken a permanent table near the window, the same one I'd sat at when she handed me my father's lighter. From there I could watch sunlight filter through the glass landing on the tiny plaque we'd hung by the door. Commander Thomas Hart, because honor means telling the truth. Whenever I looked at it, I felt that familiar mix of ache and peace. After the Navy corrected the record, I started writing again, not reports or articles for clicks, but the kind of stories that made people stop and feel. The first piece I published was called Restoring Honor, about my father Cole and the long road between silence and forgiveness. It wasn't a revenge piece. It was a story about what it costs to do the right thing. The response shocked me. Letters started arriving, actual handwritten letters from veterans' wives, from grandsons who never knew what happened to their grandfathers, from former shipmates who wanted to talk about the things they'd buried for decades. Some thanked me. Others just needed to be heard. One letter came from a woman in Maine whose husband had died in a helicopter crash that was ruled pilot error. She wrote, "I used to think justice meant someone paying for it. Now I think justice means telling what really happened so I can breathe again." That's when I realized this story wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been silenced by paperwork or pride. Uncle Ray became the unofficial coordinator of the Second Chances program. He came every week, clipboard in hand, helping vets navigate claims and locate missing records. The man who once told me to leave the past buried was now the loudest advocate for digging it up properly. Mom joined him sometimes, baking cookies for the Friday meetings. She still couldn't talk about Dad for long, but she smiled now when his name came up. That was progress. Cole never showed up in person again, but every month a donation arrived in an unmarked envelope addressed to the Heart Program Fund. I didn't need his presence. His acknowledgement was enough. June kept the first letter I'd written about the cafe framed behind the counter. Not because of what you wrote, she told me, but because of what it started. She was right. The cafe wasn't just a place anymore, it was a bridge. Every conversation here was another plank laid between pain and healing. One afternoon, after everyone had gone, June poured 2 cups and sat across from me. The sunlight hit the edge of her glasses, turning them gold. So she said, "What's next for Major Hart?" I smiled. "Just Eve now." She raised an eyebrow. "All right, just Eve. What's next?" I've been thinking about expanding the column, turning it into a series. Start Over. Stories of people who rebuild their lives after losing everything: veterans, civilians, anyone who found a way back. June grinned. "Sounds like the right kind of work." "It feels that way," I said. "I guess I finally know what Dad meant." She nodded. Starting over isn't about forgetting the past. It's about making peace with it. Her words hung in the air like a hymn. Later that week, I drove out to the base cemetery again. The Arizona sun was high, baking the grass and turning the headstones pale as bone. I knelt by my father's grave, brushing dust from the carved letters. "I got the job, Dad," I whispered. "They're calling it the Start Over series. You're the first story." The wind rustled the flag above me, steady and rhythmic like a heartbeat. I reached into my bag and took out the old cafe receipt, the one that had started it all. The ink was almost gone now, but the message was still there. "Come back when you're ready to start over." "I guess I finally was," I said quietly. I tucked the receipt beneath the small rock at the base of his stone, the way Marines sometimes leave coins at a grave to say I was here. "You're remembered." That evening I returned to the second cup for the monthly meeting. The place was full, voices low but warm, like a steady hum of belonging. I gave my usual short talk about how to request old service records, how to file appeals, how to keep going even when the system forgets your name. When the questions ended, I looked around the room and said, "If anyone here thinks it's too late to make things right, you're wrong. The truth doesn't expire. It just waits for us to be brave enough to find it." People nodded, some wiping tears, others smiling through them. Afterward, a young woman approached me, maybe mid-20s, Army Reserve patch on her jacket. She held out a folded piece of paper. "I found this in my dad's things," she said. "It just says, 'Meet me at the second cup.'" I thought maybe it was a coincidence until I heard your story online. I smiled. It's never a coincidence, I told her. Sometimes the people we lose still know where to send us. She laughed softly, then hugged me, and I felt something shift like a circle closing and another opening right behind it. When the crowd thinned out, I sat back at my table sipping the last of my coffee. Outside, dusk was falling, the neon sign flickering softly in the window. June was wiping down counters, humming an old Navy tune. I took the Zippo from my pocket, flicked it open, and watched the flame catch for a moment before closing it again. That tiny flash of light had become my reminder that nothing truly ends, it just changes form. For a long while I just sat there watching the world slow down. Then I leaned into the mic we used for our recordings and spoke quietly for the next episode. Sometimes starting over isn't a choice, it's a calling. It's the universe whispering, "You're not finished yet." If this story found you tonight, maybe it's because you needed to hear that. So tell me, what truth have you been avoiding? What story needs to be told before you can start again? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you know someone who's still carrying their silence, share this with them. Maybe this is their signal to come back. I smiled, imagining my father listening somewhere beyond the static. Until next time, I said softly, keep your faith, keep your honor, and never stop telling the truth. The cafe bell rang as the last customer left and the lights dimmed. The flame of the Zippo reflected once on the window before I tucked it back into my pocket. Starting over wasn't about finding closure, it was about keeping the story alive.